The first time I noticed the camera, it was a bright Saturday morning in early spring. The kind of morning when the neighborhood felt alive with possibility. Lawns being mowed, kids riding bikes, the faint hum of someone power washing their driveway. But while I was sipping my coffee on the back deck, my eyes landed on a faint glimmer from across the fence. At first, I thought it was just sunlight bouncing off a window. Then I realized it wasn't a window at all. It was a lens. A black, unblinking eye staring directly into my yard. The house belonged to Karen. Every neighborhood has one. A person who believes their personal mission is to enforce every possible rule, whether written in the HOA handbook or made up on the spot. Karen had lived across from me for 3 years, and in that time, she had left complaint slips on my door for everything from leaving trash cans out an hour too long to letting my daughter's chalk drawings cover the sidewalk. She was relentless, self-righteous, and oddly obsessed with knowing what everyone else was doing at all times. Still, even by her standards, this was something new. At first, I told myself it couldn't be what it looked like. Maybe it was a security camera angled awkwardly. Maybe it wasn't even real. But as the days passed, I noticed there were more. One above her garage, pointed not at her driveway but angled toward my backyard. Another tucked beneath the eaves of her house, aimed suspiciously low. And the one on the fence, so obvious once you saw it, directly overlooking my garden and deck. It felt invasive. Every time I stepped outside, the back of my neck prickled with the awareness of being watched. My daughter complained she didn't want to play in the yard anymore. She said she didn't like the robot eyes. My wife began closing the curtains during the day, shutting out the natural light because she couldn't shake the feeling someone was watching from across the fence. Karen never addressed it directly, of course. That was her style. She preferred silent intimidation, the kind that gnawed at you until you reacted. And in truth, that was exactly what I was doing. Reacting. I found myself altering my habits, avoiding the deck, letting the yard go unkempt just so I wouldn't spend time outside. For her, it must have been a victory. For me, it was the beginning of something much bigger. After a week, I decided I needed to document it. I walked the perimeter of my yard with my phone, filming the angles, the obvious sight lines. I wanted evidence. If Karen ever pushed things too far, or if I needed to file a formal complaint, I would have something concrete to point to. I thought I was being smart, but what I didn't realize then was that Karen was playing a different game altogether. It wasn't just surveillance. It was a show. She wanted control, yes, but she also wanted an audience. The cameras weren't for safety or deterrence. They were for power. They were her way of saying, I see you. I own your space. I only began to understand the scale of it when my neighbor Mark stopped me one morning. He asked if I'd seen myself on the neighborhood Facebook group. Confused, I pulled it up later that night. There, buried among posts about yard sales and lost pets, was a video. My video. Or rather, Karen's video of me. I was standing in my yard, scratching my head while trying to fix a loose board on the fence. The caption underneath was mocking. Something about how I couldn't maintain my property properly. The comments were brutal. Some people laughed, some defended me, but the damage was done. That's when I knew. She wasn't just spying, she was broadcasting. The videos kept coming. One showed my daughter spilling a bucket of water while watering the flowers. Another showed me struggling to drag a heavy tray, being down the driveway. Little humiliating moments. Stripped of context, repackaged as neighborhood gossip. Every clip was carefully chosen to paint us as incompetent, messy, or laughable, and every clip made its way around the block, spreading like wildfire. By the second week, I couldn't walk down the street without feeling like everyone's eyes lingered a little too long. Some looked sympathetic, others amused, and a few avoided me entirely. My family had become entertainment, and Karen was the director. But what Karen didn't realize was that she had overplayed her hand. For all her smugness, all her need for control, she made a critical mistake. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she had the upper hand, with her cameras and her curated videos. What she didn't realize was that people were starting to see through it. I wasn't the only one who noticed the invasive angles of those cameras. Other neighbors began whispering that Karen had gone too far. Parents complained their kids couldn't play outside without being recorded. Couples wondered if their arguments on the porch were being captured. The more Karen pushed, the more paranoid everyone became. And paranoia, once it takes root, spreads quickly. The tipping point came one humid evening when I was out front, trimming the hedges. A couple down the street approached quietly, almost sheepishly. They told me they, too, had been filmed. Their daughter had been caught on camera chasing the family dog, and the footage had somehow made its way into a group chat, where it was mocked. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me. It was bigger. Karen wasn't spying on one house. She was spying on the whole block. And in that realization, I found something I hadn't felt in weeks: resolve. If Karen wanted an audience, I'd give her one, but not the kind she controlled. I was going to show everyone exactly what she was doing. And when I was finished, Karen wouldn't be the neighborhood watchdog anymore. She'd be the neighborhood punchline. The plan was only forming in my head that night, rough and unpolished. But I knew one thing: her own cameras, her own obsession, were about to become the very tools of her downfall. And as I closed the blinds and shut off the lights, I knew the game had only just begun. The first step in any battle is understanding the enemy. And in this case, my enemy wasn't just Karen. It was the story she was telling. She had spent weeks crafting a narrative, one where I was the bumbling, careless neighbor, and she was the vigilant guardian of community standards. Her cameras were her weapons, and her social media presence was her stage. If I wanted to fight back, I couldn't just complain. I had to rewrite the story. That realization kept me awake at night, pacing the living room long after the house had gone quiet. I studied the videos she posted, scrutinizing every angle, every detail. The camera quality was decent, but not professional, which meant she wasn't using a security company. These were off-the-shelf consumer cameras, ones with apps, logins, and data storage. That meant they had weaknesses. I started documenting everything. Every time I saw a red light blink in my yard, I noted it down. Every unusual shadow or angle I photographed. By the end of the week, I had a growing folder filled with pictures of cameras perched like vultures along Karen's property. I even mapped out where they pointed, drawing crude sketches that showed how her surveillance overlapped not just into my yard, but into several others. It wasn't paranoia, it was proof. The neighborhood was restless. The couple who had spoken to me about their daughter wasn't the only one with concerns. Whispers floated at mailboxes and on sidewalks. Karen had clips of kids playing, couples arguing, even neighbors enjoying drinks on their patios. At first, it was just gossip. But then, little by little, people started admitting they'd seen themselves or their families in private Facebook groups and chats. Not everyone had been targeted, but enough had to plant seeds of distrust. Still, most people didn't want to confront her directly. Karen had a reputation for aggression, for turning every dispute into a spectacle. People feared retaliation. That's when I realized I was the one already in her crosshairs. My family had nothing left to lose, so I became the one to act. I knew Karen craved control, but like all people obsessed with power, she also craved recognition. That was her weakness. I started feeding her little performances, fake mistakes, staged moments in the yard that looked clumsy or ridiculous on the surface. I left a trash bag accidentally ripped open near the curb. I pretended to struggle with a ladder. I exaggerated every mundane task, knowing she couldn't resist capturing it. And she didn't. Within days, new clips surfaced online. The ripped trash bag became a post about neighborhood cleanliness. The ladder incident was captioned with a smug reminder about home safety. My neighbors laughed, some at me, some at her, but I didn't care. Every new post was evidence, undeniable proof that her cameras weren't for security at all. While she thought she was mocking me, I was collecting her footprints. Screenshots, timestamps, video downloads. Each one showed her obsession laid bare. Each one showed that she was watching, recording, and sharing without consent. But I needed more. I needed to expose her not just as a nuisance, but as a danger to the community. That meant showing people what she was truly capable of. One afternoon, while trimming the hedge near the property line, I noticed something new. A smaller hidden camera had been wired to a tree in her yard, the lens tilted ever so slightly toward my daughter's swing set. That was the line. Whatever petty feud Karen thought she was fighting, she had crossed into something far more disturbing. That night, I compiled everything into a presentation. Not for the HOA, at least not yet. No, this was for the court of public opinion. Because in neighborhoods like ours, reputations were everything. And Karen had built hers on the illusion of authority. I was about to dismantle it piece by piece. I reached out quietly to a few of the families who had confided in me. I showed them the evidence, screenshots of posts, timestamps, overlapping camera angles. Their reactions confirmed what I already knew. Outrage, disgust, disbelief. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone. She had been watching them all. The idea came almost too naturally. If Karen wanted to broadcast her curated narrative, I would broadcast the truth. But instead of hiding in Facebook groups or private chats, I'd take it to the one stage she couldn't control, the neighborhood itself. The plan began with a projector. A simple rental, nothing fancy, but powerful enough to cast clear images against the side of my garage for anyone walking by to see. The timing was important. Friday evening, when families were out walking dogs, kids were on bikes, and the air was thick with chatter. I wouldn't need to invite anyone. The crowd would gather on its own. As the day approached, Karen kept posting. More clips of me, more smug captions, more petty attempts at humiliation. But what she didn't realize was that every post was adding weight to the rope she was tying around her own reputation. Every video was another nail in the coffin. Friday evening arrived. I set up the projector quietly, almost casually, making sure it faced outward where the entire street could see. The sun dipped low, the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple. People began to notice the equipment, curiosity pulling them closer. And then, with the push of a button, the truth lit up the side of my garage. The first image was simple. A map of Karen's cameras, complete with arrows showing their invasive angles. Gasps rippled through the crowd as parents recognized their backyards and porches. Next came the screenshots, her mocking posts, the humiliating captions, the proof that she was deliberately spying, recording, and sharing. Laughter mixed with anger as people connected the dots. Then came the footage itself. Not my staged performances, though those earned chuckles, but the raw invasiveness of her obsession. Children playing, neighbors relaxing, families unaware they were being watched. Karen had built her empire on secrecy and control. Now, her empire was on full display, and the audience wasn't laughing with her anymore. They were laughing at her. The murmurs grew into outrage. People pointed, whispered, shook their heads. Some stormed off toward their homes, no doubt planning their own confrontations. Others stayed, glued to the unfolding spectacle. And through it all, I could feel the shift. Karen's power wasn't just slipping, it was shattering. But the night wasn't over. Because even as her reputation crumbled in front of the block, I knew Karen wouldn't take this lying down. She had always thrived on escalation, and this was the biggest blow she had ever taken. The question wasn't whether she would retaliate. It was how. The morning after the projector night, the neighborhood was buzzing. People spoke in hushed tones over fences, lingered longer at mailboxes, and exchanged knowing glances when Karen's name came up. The balance had shifted. For once, the self-appointed queen of the block wasn't dictating the conversation. She was the subject of it. and not in the way she liked. But if I had learned anything about Karen, it was that she thrived in chaos. Humiliation was fuel for her fire, not water to extinguish it. She wouldn't disappear quietly. She would double down. By mid-afternoon, the first signs of her retaliation appeared. Handwritten flyers began circulating, slipped into mailboxes, tucked under doormats, pinned to the community bulletin board near the pool. Each one was a rant in black marker, warning of dangerous neighbors and malicious lies. She accused me of manipulating footage, of spreading false information, of being a threat to the safety of the community. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, erratic and angry, the kind of scrawl that betrayed desperation more than authority. Then came the emails. Neighbors whispered about long, rambling messages Karen had sent out, complete with distorted screenshots and her own analysis of why the cameras were necessary. She painted herself as the victim, a lone woman, bravely trying to keep the neighborhood safe from supposed rule breakers and vandals. It was almost laughable. Almost. Because the real blow didn't come from flyers or emails. It came from the HOA. 2 days after the projector incident, I received a formal notice in the mail. The letter claimed I had created a public disturbance by projecting images onto my garage and disrupting neighborhood harmony. It was a violation of community bylaws, and I was warned that continued behavior like this could result in fines. Karen had struck exactly where she knew it would hurt. The HOA board. She had always had allies there, people who either feared her wrath or genuinely believed her act as the neighborhood enforcer. And now, she had leveraged them against me. It was infuriating. She was the one violating privacy, the one mocking neighbors online, and yet somehow, I was the one receiving official warnings. That was Karen's skill. Twisting narratives, reframing reality until up felt like down and wrong felt like right. But what she didn't realize was that her own actions were undermining her case. By now, parents were openly complaining about their kids being filmed. Couples were whispering about consulting lawyers. A petition had even begun circulating quietly, calling for the HOA to investigate Karen's cameras. For every ally she had left on the board, she was losing 2 in the neighborhood. Still, she didn't stop. New cameras appeared. Smaller ones, harder to spot, tucked into trees or hidden under eaves. It was as if the backlash only made her more determined to expand her surveillance. Neighbors who had ignored her antics before were suddenly discovering cameras pointed at their yards, their porches, even their windows. The paranoia spread like wildfire. And then, the ultimate escalation. Karen installed a floodlight camera at the corner of her property, positioned perfectly to blast my yard with blinding white light every time I stepped outside. It wasn't about safety. It was harassment, plain and simple. That was the night I realized this wasn't just a feud anymore. It was psychological warfare. Every time I let my dog out, the light would snap on, cameras whirring. Every time I watered the garden, the sensors picked up my movement, recording, watching, storing. My backyard, the place that was supposed to be private, mine, was gone. But even in her most aggressive moves, Karen couldn't resist one thing: an audience. She still posted clips online, though now they were laced with a sharper edge, angrier captions, more defensive commentary. She wanted to control the story, to rally whatever allies she had left. That obsession was her undoing. Because what Karen failed to realize was that her hunger for control had crossed into illegality. Recording children, blasting lights into neighboring yards, using cameras beyond the scope of personal security, these weren't just annoyances. These were violations of state privacy laws and HOA bylaws alike. And while Karen had managed to sick the HOA on me once, the growing stack of evidence was beginning to sway the tide. More neighbors began forwarding me her posts. Parents dropped off screenshots at my door. What had started as a personal battle was quickly turning into a community uprising. The question wasn't whether Karen would fall, it was when. But I couldn't relax yet.
I'm standing here
because
today with this
the more
esteemed
desperate
group
she
of my
grew,
colleagues
the more
who
unpredictable
all
she
share
became.
my vision for a
One
brighter
evening,
future.
I caught her pacing in her yard, phone in hand, her voice raised, eyes darting toward my house as she gestured wildly. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. It was clear she was plotting, planning, preparing her next move. And I knew, whatever it was, it wouldn't just target me. It would target everyone who had dared to stand against her. The block had seen the first cracks in her armor, but the real storm was only just beginning. If the projector night had planted seeds of doubt, the weeks that followed made them bloom into full-grown resentment. Karen's obsession no longer felt like a private nuisance. It was a neighborhood plague. And like any plague, it spread quickly, touching families who once believed they were immune. It began with the children. Parents started comparing stories, realizing that their kids had appeared in Karen's clips. A toddler running through sprinklers, a teenager skateboarding down the street, a group of friends tossing a football across the yard, all turned into content for her running commentary. She tried to pass it off as neighborhood safety monitoring, but no one believed that anymore. The posts were mocking, tinted with judgment, designed to embarrass rather than protect. One mother confided to me that her daughter had come home in tears after seeing herself in one of Karen's videos. Another father told me he had stopped letting his boys ride bikes near her house because he didn't want them recorded. What had once been a neighborhood playground was becoming a minefield, and Karen was the one laying the traps. The tension deepened when couples began noticing more sinister invasions. A camera catching them on their porch with wine glasses in hand. A heated argument in their driveway, suddenly whispered about by others who shouldn't have known. Karen's Kie. Maris weren't just capturing harmless antics anymore, they were exposing private lives, moments meant for no one, but those who lived them. The whispers grew louder. People started referring to Karen's property as the Watchtower. Neighbors avoided walking on her side of the street. Conversations died when she appeared, but for all the anger building against her, few were willing to act openly. Fear still lingered. The same fear that had silenced people for years, the fear of becoming her next target. And yet, cracks were forming in her control. The petition to investigate her surveillance had gathered signatures quietly, discreetly passed around at backyard barbecues and neighborhood gatherings. By the time it reached me, it had more than half the block's support. Parents, retirees, young couples, different households with one common frustration. They were done being watched. The HOA board couldn't ignore it forever. Not when the complaints kept multiplying. Not when inboxes filled with screenshots and recordings of her posts, and certainly not when the petition grew large enough to represent a majority of the community. But Karen, of course, didn't back down. She doubled her efforts. The floodlight cameras multiplied, turning her yard into a glowing fortress. More handwritten notes appeared, this time stuffed into doors late at night, their tone increasingly hostile. She accused neighbors of conspiring against her, of vandalism, of harassment. The more isolated she became, the louder her accusations grew. Paranoia had her in its grip. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I caught her pacing her driveway, phone held high, recording the darkened windows of nearby homes. She muttered under her breath, spinning in circles, the glow of her camera light cutting across the quiet street. It was unnerving, like watching a spotlight sweep a prison yard. The turning point came when one of her own allies finally broke. For years, Mrs. Leonard, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down, had defended Karen. She saw her as a protector, someone who kept the neighborhood in order. But when Mrs. Leonard's visiting grandchildren were caught on Karen's cameras and mocked in a late-night post, her loyalty crumbled. The next morning, she was at my door, petition in hand, adding her signature with trembling determination. That single signature changed everything. If even Karen's staunchest defender could see the truth, then no one could deny what she had become. By the end of the week, the HOA had no choice. An emergency meeting was called, the kind that drew a crowd too large for the usual conference room. The community center buzzed with tension as families filed in, eyes darting toward Karen, who sat rigid in the front row, a binder of papers clutched against her chest. She wore the smug smile of someone convinced of her righteousness, but her hands betrayed her, fidgeting with the edges of her notes. One by one, neighbors spoke. Parents described their children's humiliation. Couples recounted moments of privacy exposed. Others spoke of the lights, the cameras, the constant harassment. Each testimony chipped away at Karen's armor, her smile twitching as the weight of public opinion bore down. When it was my turn, I didn't rant. I didn't accuse. I simply laid out the evidence. Screenshots, timestamps, the map of her camera coverage. I projected it onto the wall for everyone to see, just as I had done on my garage weeks earlier. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, as reality set in. Karen tried to speak then, flipping through her binder, raising her voice in defiance. She called it a conspiracy, claimed she was the victim of a smear campaign, but no one was listening anymore. The tide had turned. The room wasn't with her. It was against her. The HOA president cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, and announced that a formal investigation would be launched. Karen's cameras, at least those aimed at other properties, would need to come down pending review. It wasn't the final blow, but it was the first real consequence she had faced. And that was when Karen's mask finally cracked. She stood, binder slamming shut, her voice shrill as she shouted about betrayal, about ungrateful neighbors, about how she was the only one holding the community together. Her words tumbled out in a chaotic storm, but no one responded. People simply watched, some shaking their heads, others whispering to each other. She was unraveling, and everyone could see it. When she stormed out of the meeting, binder clutched tight against her chest. The room exhaled as if a pressure valve had been released. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't the one controlling the conversation. But as I walked home that night, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat. The investigation was a victory, yes, but it was also a corner. And when someone like Karen is backed into a corner, they don't retreat quietly. They lash out. And deep down, I knew her most dangerous move was still to come. The days following the HOA meeting were strangely quiet. For the first time in months, the floodlights across the street didn't flicker on at random hours. The neighborhood Facebook group, once dominated by Karen's posts, fell silent. Even the cameras, though still perched like sentries along her eaves, no longer seemed to blink as often. It was the kind of calm that didn't feel like peace. It felt like a pause, a momentary stillness before the storm. Neighbors carried on cautiously, as if afraid to jinx the fragile lull. Children played again, though their parents kept wary eyes on the fences. Couples lingered on porches, voices hushed, glances darting toward Karen's house. We all knew it wasn't over. The silence was too deliberate, too unnatural. And then, just as everyone began to exhale, Karen erupted. It started one Thursday evening, when a screeching alarm tore through the block. A piercing Serbian, followed by the blinding strobe of her floodlights, turned the quiet street into a stage. Doors opened, heads peeked out, and within minutes, half the neighborhood stood in their yards, confused and irritated. Karen emerged from her house like a general marching onto a battlefield. Phone in hand, camera light blazing, she paced her driveway, screaming about intruders, vandals, spies. She claimed she had caught them on camera and insisted that the neighborhood was under attack. But when pressed, she offered nothing. No footage, no proof, just frantic gestures and accusations that seemed to shift from one family to another. The more she shouted, the clearer it became. She wasn't fighting an intruder. She was fighting shadows. Shadows of her own paranoia. Her cameras whirred and clicked, floodlights flashing with every movement. She filmed children clutching their parents' hands, couples standing on their porches, even the mailman who happened to be finishing his route. To Karen, everyone was a suspect. Everyone was an enemy. The spectacle lasted nearly an hour. By the time the sirens finally died, the damage was done. The block had seen her unravel in real time, no longer the composed protector she pretended to be, but a frantic figure lashing out at anyone within sight. After that night, the neighborhood was different. Conversations that once ended with, "but maybe she means well," now ended with, "something has to be done." The fence-sitters, the silent allies, the ones who had avoided choosing sides, one by one they shifted. The fear of Karen's wrath no longer outweighed the exhaustion of living under her surveillance. But Karen didn't stop. If anything, she escalated further. New posts appeared online, but they weren't mocking or smug anymore. They were rants, long, unhinged monologues accusing specific neighbors of harassment, conspiracy, even criminal behavior. She called people thieves, vandals, trespassers. She named names, screenshots spread quickly, fueling outrage, and those she accused began threatening legal action. Then came the night when her cameras betrayed her completely. A neighbor 2 doors down, fed up with the floodlights, decided to record one of Karen's late-night patrols. From the shadows, he captured her pacing her yard, muttering to herself, shouting into her phone, swinging a flashlight like a sword. The footage showed not a protector, not a victim, but a woman consumed by obsession, unraveling in the glow of her own surveillance. When the video hit the neighborhood group chat, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere. Text threads, email chains, whispered about on porches. Karen had always thrived on having the camera pointed outward, but now the lens had turned back on her. The laughter came first. Jokes about Neighborhood Watch, the Karen edition, and Lights Camera Meltdown. But beneath the humor was something sharper. Resolve. People began contacting the HOA directly, not with whispers, but with demands. The petition grew louder, calls for immediate removal of her cameras stronger. Parents threatened to escalate beyond the HOA, to city officials and police. The block had shifted from tolerance to rebellion, and Karen was the catalyst. But if anyone thought she would quietly accept defeat, they didn't know Karen. The night before the HOA was scheduled to reconvene, the floodlights flared again. The sirens blared, louder than before. But this time, it wasn't just alarms. Music blasted through outdoor speakers, screeching, distorted, the kind of noise designed to rattle nerves. She was staging a performance, one last desperate attempt to assert control. Neighbors poured out of their homes, some shouting in frustration, others recording the chaos. Children cried, dogs barked, voices rose, and in the center of it all was Karen, binder clutched to her chest, shouting into her phone, lights and camera, swirling around her like a grotesque stage show. It was no longer surveillance. It was spectacle, and it was impossible to ignore. By the time the police arrived, summoned by multiple frantic calls, the damage was irreversible. Officers spoke to her calmly, trying to de-escalate, but even their presence didn't silence her. She pointed to her cameras, shouted about conspiracies, waved her binder like evidence. The officers exchanged weary glances and finally, gently, guided her back inside. The block stood in silence afterward. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering about what they had just witnessed. It wasn't funny anymore. It wasn't even frustrating. It was sad, unsettling, and dangerous. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing again, but this time it wasn't just talk. Complaints were filed. Formal reports were made. The HOA board, overwhelmed with pressure, had no choice but to act. An emergency vote was called. For years, Karen had been the one holding the reins of control, dictating rules, spreading fear. But now, for the first time, the block was united, not in fear of her, but against her. And as the vote loomed, one thing became clear. Karen's reign was ending. The only question was how spectacularly it would collapse. The morning of the vote felt different. The air was sharp with anticipation, like the hush before a storm breaks. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for years now exchanged nods of solidarity. Parents shepherded children to school with a spring in their step. The block wasn't divided anymore. It was united, and its focus was singular: Karen. The emergency HOA meeting drew more people than any in recent memory. Folding chairs lined the community center, filled shoulder to shoulder with residents, their faces tight with determination. Even those who had remained neutral for years showed up, pulled out of hiding by Karen's latest spiral. The chatter buzzed like static, punctuated by the occasional laugh as people traded stories of the chaos she had caused. When Karen entered, the room seemed to shift. She still clutched her binder, still wore the same stiff smile, but her presence no longer commanded attention. It drew whispers, stares, and thinly veiled smirks. Her reputation, the one she had cultivated with cameras and control, was in tatters before she even sat down. The board began with order, but the meeting quickly became a reckoning. Neighbors lined up to speak, each testimony sharper than the last. Parents recounted sleepless nights under blinding floodlights. Couples described the humiliation of private moments turned into neighborhood gossip. Elderly residents spoke of fear, of feeling trapped in their own homes. Then came the video, the footage of Karen pacing her yard, muttering, floodlights flashing. The board hadn't planned to show it, but one neighbor insisted, and soon the projection lit up the wall. Gasps rippled through the room. The figure on the screen was not a protector, not even a nuisance. It was a woman unraveling, consumed by her own obsession. Karen tried to defend herself, her voice sharp, binder pages flapping as she insisted it was evidence of community vigilance. But the words rang hollow. The board didn't nod. The neighbors didn't clap. The silence that met her was deafening. The vote was swift. Cameras facing into other properties, to be removed immediately. Floodlights aimed beyond her yard, dismantled. Harassment and unauthorized sharing of footage. Grounds for further disciplinary review. For the first time, the rules she had wielded like weapons were turned back on her, and there was nothing she could do. But the true collapse didn't happen in the boardroom. It happened in the neighborhood itself. The following days were a parade of consequences. Technicians arrived to remove the offending cameras, climbing ladders while neighbors watched from porches. Each dismantled. Lens was a victory. Each unplugged floodlight a sigh of relief. Parents let their kids play outside again, cheering when the oppressive glare finally faded. Karen, of course, tried to fight it. She stood in her driveway, shouting at the workers, waving her binder like a legal shield. But the workers ignored her. They had the board's order, and her protests fell flat. The block stood witness, some laughing quietly, others shaking their heads. For once, she wasn't the watcher. She was the spectacle. And then came the final humiliation. Someone, no one ever admitted who, compiled a montage of her posts, her rants, her frantic nighttime patrols, and shared it not just in the neighborhood chat, but across wider community forums. Within days, Karen wasn't just the talk of our street. She was the talk of the entire town. Jokes spread, memes circulated, and her name became shorthand for paranoia. The very tools she had used to spy and mock had become the instruments of her own ridicule. Her binder disappeared after that. Her driveway patrols stopped. Curtains stayed drawn, and the once blazing floodlights went dark. Karen remained in her house, but her presence no longer loomed. She had gone from feared enforcer to neighborhood punchline, her power broken not by confrontation, but by exposure. Life slowly returned to normal. Kids laughed in yards again. Couples sipped wine on porches. Neighbors waved without glancing nervously at her property. The block felt lighter, freer, as though a weight had been lifted. And though the scars of her surveillance lingered, they were fading with every ordinary, unrecorded moment. As for me, I no longer felt the prickling eyes of unseen cameras when I stepped outside. My backyard was mine again, private, peaceful, untouched. The very place where Karen had tried to assert her control became the stage for her downfall, and the neighborhood never forgot it. Karen had built her empire on control, on the illusion that she was the one watching, the one dictating,